in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 27. 2 more chapters in this book, and we will have covered it pretty well. Right now, in chapter 27, from chapter 19 moving forward, Paul has set his face towards Rome. He knows he's going to Rome, and we've talked about this. This is where Paul's confidence is coming from. He has this great confidence and faith. He knows that's where he's going because God is telling him this. And we learn a lot about how our faith should be affected by what God says as well through that. So this is no different. And I think, again, to put ourselves into the story, has anybody been on the ocean, on the high seas at all? Anybody? Carol? Betty? Was it anybody else? On a cruise. Was it rough at all? Kathy, you're saying yes? What was it? And what was that like? It was nauseous. Okay. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. Because I've been fishing a couple of times on these overnight trips, these 2-day trips. And when you're out there, you're thinking, well, they're not going to turn around and take me home because I'm not feeling well. And of course, what I experienced anyway was nothing like what we're going to read about today. But it can feel horrible being in that position, and we don't have the map to look at. But we're going to, Paul ends up in Malta at the end of this chapter. And essentially, they kind of have to hug the coast. Does anybody sail? Does anybody know anything about sailing at all? You know a little bit about sailing? Yeah. So there are ways to sail with the wind, even though it's not taking you like straight ahead, right? You can tack and go. I think there's like a 15-degree variation that you let the wind blow you this way, and then you turn your sail, and then it blows you back the other way. So even though you're kind of going against the wind, you're actually going in the other direction. And this is kind of what has to happen with Paul in his boats that he's on. Now, in this first boat, we can't really know how big it is, but then he gets into this Alexandrian boat. I'm just trying to give us some context. Did anybody look at what this Alexandrian ship would look like? Well, how many people were on this ship? 276. Okay?
The centurion could have had up to 100 men.
Yes.
So he had soldiers, and then there were other prisoners, and then there were the crew.
The crew and possibly some passengers as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Yeah, this Alexandrian, it's surmised that this Alexandrian ship was actually a grain vessel. So they go north up towards Turkey first. And that's when they take this Alexandrian ship from there. And there's 276 people. That's a lot of people. Like on the fishing vessel that I was on, it's 70 foot long, and there was about 60 or 70 of us on there. And we were pretty much shoulder to shoulder fishing most of the time. So this thing was supposed to be these big ships were about 180 foot long and about 36 feet wide. Very big ship. This is not like Peter's fishing boat. This thing's huge. So it has a lot of cargo, and since there's cargo on board, if you're the captain, you're responsible for that. So you're making decisions based on, well, we can't just wait around and have this cargo go bad. We have to go deliver it. So there's all of these things playing into the decisions that are being made at this moment. We're also there's going to be this term about fasting, and we'll get into that a little bit and why that is important to the story. Just because of the time of year that they leave. And it's you kind of have to. They have a harvest at the end of summer. There's also one in the fall. But there's one in the summer, and you need to get that stuff out and to the people. Okay, so before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Holy Father, we are so thankful, Lord, that you love us so much, that you have made your church for us to gather around your word. And for us, your word is the most precious thing we have other than your Son, for it helps us to know who you are. We hope and pray, Lord, that all things we do today would be pleasing to you. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, first I need to change this. 2 Corinthians 11. I'm just going to read through this really quick because just, again, to get us into the story, where Paul is in his life. He's likely in his 50s, maybe his mid to late 50s, maybe older. He's not a young man. He spent a lot of years building churches. And in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, and we all know this, he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. And he's talking about these other apostles and stuff. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so. In far more labors and far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. And this is supposedly before this shipwreck. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. So he was stuck out in the water for a time. I have been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among the false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the Gentiles. So this is Paul's life. This is where he is. And this is where he is in this story. He's this guy. He's been beat up the last how many years that's been going on constantly. And people have been trying to kill him and do all these things. And that was just kind of him kind of reiterating it. You know, you want to talk about the apostles. Well, here's what I've been through. So that's where Paul is. Okay, so where we left off, Paul has finalized his arguments about the gospel. And Agrippa and Festus are going, wow, this guy doesn't deserve death, that's for sure. But he says he wants to go to Rome, so we got to send him to Rome. So chapter 27, starting at verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking on an Adramyttian ship, you know, I practiced that 7 times yesterday. I still stumbled over it. Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myrna in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had to ride off Cnidus. Since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering. The majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along close inshore. But before long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let it ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island named Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And this is getting really nasty. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Okay, so this is a terrible story. And like I say, if you've ever been out to sea, and in this area, I don't know if you can picture that Mediterranean area, that big sea, and they go up the coast, not, with no very small, it was navigable. They could do this. Did I just say that? That was a good word. They could do this. So they make it up to where they need to go, and that ship needed to go further north to its home port, so they got on this other ship, which is this big cargo ship. And likely a lot of them didn't have like quarters to sleep in. A lot of them probably were on board, above board, having to sleep in the open. So the area that they get stuck, it's called the Adriatic in this instance, and the Adriatic actually came much further south than it is today. And it's the longest part of the stretch when this wind comes up. Okay, so who was with Paul? That's the first question. Who's with Paul on this journey? What other Christians, I think, is more specific. Okay? Okay. So, and I just bring this up because, Luke, but when he's writing this, he has to insert himself into the story by his personal pronouns. He says, we were there, and Aristarchus is there. Is that a big deal? Yeah. Why is that a big deal? They get shipwrecked too. Anything else? I mean, when we've just covered these 26 chapters. And this is this is not a year, this is not 6 months. This is years and years and years and years. And this is what I consider anyway. I think about these guys. They're giving up their livelihoods. I mean, maybe they haven't, like, maybe Aristarchus is a wealthy man. I don't know. We don't know anything about him. But he's from where? Thessalonica. What's he doing down in Judea? What's he doing down? Maybe he was a Jew. Yeah, okay, well, but he's with Paul. He's putting all of his livelihood, he's putting his position with it. If he's a Jew, which maybe he isn't. But even if you're not a Jew, if you're a Gentile and calling yourself a Christian, you're still risking things. Okay.
Probably one of the ones that took funds up to Judea when they went to Judea. So that's the reason he was with Paul.
Yeah.
And he stayed with Paul through his 2-year imprisonment.
He does.
He was with him all the time. Now Luke was not with him while he was down that 2 years.
Right.
But he was probably close by where he could still take care of Paul. So
yeah, and Paul, when we were reading through all of that, I called Paul a great manager, because that's what he's doing. He's managing all these people. He's going, you guys go over here, Timothy and Silas, you go over here, because we're going to be there in a month or a week or 3 weeks, and so be ready for us. Or he would send for people, we need these people to come support us. So he has this great, that's my point. This is Paul, because Paul is the kind of I don't want to call him the star, because Jesus is the star, right? But Paul is the guy right now who's doing all of this work. But he is assisted by so many people, and this is what we learn about evangelism, isn't it? You've got an evangelist, and you have other people supporting this evangelism. And this is exactly what's going on. And you have guys like Luke, and Luke's not a Jew, and Aristarchus, maybe he's not a Jew, but they see enough value in what's going on with this gospel. They see the power of this gospel. Well, they've seen miracles, and they're attaching themselves to this Paul guy and just walking away from their lives, and maybe they just happen to be in that position, and they're looking at their lives and saying, maybe this is why God put me here, and I need to go do this. So I just think it's admirable. That's how I think about it. It's just a great thing, and they're putting themselves in harm's way, in my mind. And we're going to see why they probably thought this was not a good idea to go on this trip, but they went anyway. Does anybody know anything about this Augustan cohort? Did anybody look anything about what that was? Yeah, this is like the Secret Service. This is an elite group. It isn't part of the regular army, but if you're going to attach the name, Augustus Caesar to a guard, they have to be a special guard. So this is all kind of, all these little hints that this is the providence that I see. God puts in charge of these people, this very elite guard to watch over them. And Julius, how is Paul being treated by Julius? He's being treated well, isn't he? Why do you suppose that is? Okay, all right. Yeah, we've looked at that Paul's Roman citizenship, he's already leveraged that, right? That started with Lysias. He says, as Paul's being stretched out so he can be scourged. He says, you think you should be doing this to a Roman citizen? And then all these things started. That's when the dominoes start falling. Jeff and then Aaron.
Well, it could also be that he's been watching over him for a while, and just like the prison guard when Joseph was thrown in prison in Egypt, he saw that everything that was happened to Joseph was, for the good. Well, maybe everything happening to Paul, these things are God's. God's with him. He's got some influence here with a higher power. So
I agree with that. I think he sees this faith. I don't, he isn't converted, but he sees this faith. He sees who Paul is. Paul isn't some kind of criminal. Aaron?
Yeah, I think it's been said. Yeah, the way he carries himself is he's not a wicked man. He's not a criminal. He's not a thief. He's not dishonest. The way that his character is one that is, courteous and polite and respectful. And when you act that way and you treat other people courteously and with respect, you tend to receive it.
Okay, I'm just going to put this here. When you're acting like a Christian, right? Jeff brought up Joseph. Same thing with Joseph. He goes into prison. He's treated well because they see that everything he does, that God's with him, and this is what they believe. They have whatever faith they have. Who else is like that? We're going to do a study on who coming up. Daniel. Same thing. Daniel goes to jail. And it's the same sort of thing. God shows favor. It's God showing favor. And again, I see this providence happening. Paul brings the same point out when he talks in Galatians, when he talks about, I think it's Galatians or Ephesians, when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. What are the kinds of things that are the fruit of the Spirit? And this is just the Christian living thing, right? What are some of those fruits? If we were to generalize it with a couple of them, what is it? Love, joy, peace, patience, all these very good things. And what does Paul say about that? He says, against that there is no law. And he also talks about if somebody's going to accuse you of something, and this is something that the apostles see. If somebody's going to accuse you of something, what's it going to be? Well, he's doing these good things as a Christian. He just wants good things for people. I'm sick of that. That just doesn't wash. And for me, when I read this and I see that somebody is showing favor to somebody who is being godly and showing their faith, that's just what we see over and over again throughout the Scriptures. And this is, for me, again, it's God's providence. Okay. So Julius does treat him well, and he lets Paul go see some friends so he can receive care. That's how version talks about it. So if Paul, is he sick? And if he is sick, then why doesn't that factor into the story more? Anybody have any insights on Paul himself on that? Okay, that's why I read that. Yeah, his body's beat up. It really is. And a scourging would kill a lot of people. And he'd been scourged and well, he was left for dead when he was stung. So as strong as he is, what else do we know about him? He has some sort of affliction. We know he asks for it to be taken away, and Jesus says no. So Paul, as strong as he is, faithfully and physically, obviously, he goes on this journey. He's got some issues. He's got some health issues. Jeff.
Yeah, I'm not, the King James just says to refresh himself.
Right.
Go into his friends to refresh himself. So it might not be a physical ailment or whatever. It could just be encouragement. It's like all these things he's been going through, and
Right.
I'm going on, and he gets encouragement from brethren there in the area. So uplift him and keep him spirits, because even the prophets in the Old Testament, they got discouraged sometimes when being persecuted and stuff, and God said, hey, you're not the only one, so it could have been just encouragement.
And that, again, that kind of points to our own Christianity, doesn't it, for each other, and that sort of thing about, we're not, we may not all be Pauls, but we can help somebody who is, and we can all, it's all about the, God. It's about that one goal, okay?
Well, the prisoners were not fed by the Romans. They had to have their own food. So these people might have given him some supplies to take with him, because they had to provide their own food.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Wow. Not a good time to be a prisoner. Okay. Anything else? All right. Okay, so here's my other question. If the centurion, okay, so they go on this trip, it's not easy during this time. And the wind shifts so many ways. I tried to figure out which way the wind was blowing. Which way, what's the dominant wind patterns here on the Mediterranean? And I've read, everywhere I went said something different. And the one thing I did find about this condition, I thought, Euroclydon. Does that mean it's a European wind? Does it come from Europe? Well, no, not really, but it just means heavy waves from the wind. Dave?
It clearly says that they were trying to sail into the wind.
Yeah.
So that means it was blowing at them, and the
Yes.
water was blowing at them as well, being pushed to them. And if I may, that ship, they just picked it because it was available. That was not designed for that kind of stuff, and I'll tell you why. It had like the length and the width, that's one thing. But it had a big sail, no problem.
Right.
But the rudder, it had no rudder. It had two big paddles on it.
Right.
It's not designed for that, because the rudder runs deeper than those paddles. So you're able to control the ship. That's why they lost control of the ship. So you're going into the wind full bore. It's pushing back at you, and you are not going anywhere. That's why they took off and went to a port, because Paul saw what was going on with that. So you keep going. You see that the centurion also sided with the helmsman. That guy should have known better. Seriously, not to do that with a fully loaded ship like that. I have been out to sea on ships that are like not battleships, but destroyers, and those things roll and they're so the water's coming over the bow. It's crazy. It's scary.
And that's what was happening here.
And so that's what they were going through. I would have been freaking out, because you see what happens. The guy actually the bow goes under the water and comes back up. And so I could see why they were freaking out, because like you said, they were mostly on deck. So they were getting hit with water and waves and all that stuff. No wonder they were panicking. So anyways, that's one of the primary problems, is they kept listening to the wrong advice from people. And Paul's saying, hey, trust me, basically.
Yeah, he's already been shipwrecked a few times.
So, but they
he doesn't
finally
want to
did,
do this again.
But, look what happened to get there.
Yeah, and this wind is hurricane force. It's, up at 75 miles an hour and greater. So this was no small thing. And even for today's ships, it would have been a big deal. And like what David's saying, it had a gigantic sail, and then it had a foresail up in front. But it's made of wood, and it's not like a great steel structure like you're used to building. And so, no keel. It's got 2 paddles in the back, and it was this big lumbering cargo ship. And I don't know, to be out there in the middle of this for an extended period of time just would have been frightening. Well, he says at the end of that reading, they just thought they were all going to die. Well, this is what Luke is saying. Barry.
Yeah, they were trying to crawl along the coast,
Yes.
and then they get blown way out.
Right.
And so they would have to take that large sail down. You can't have
Yes.
a large sail down in heavy winds.
Yeah.
They'd just snap the mast right off.
They do hear the very end, right? Once they know that that the ship's gone, we're going to get into that. Once they know the ship is done for, they've already, and we get into this is like this, you just see things getting worse and worse and worse. They're throwing things off the ship so they can go in a direction. They know that, but once they finally think they can make this last part of it, they put up the sail, and if it breaks, and this is the last-ditch effort. If we die, we die, then here we go. But we're going to get into Paul here, because Paul is he's going to be telling them things like, be cheerful, have more, be encouraged, because, and here they are in the middle of this gigantic hurricane, and he's telling them, be encouraged. We're going to get into that, but Jeff.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the storm hasn't started before. It was getting, that time of the year.
Exactly.
But it's like, okay, it's still calm here. We're getting ready to sail. Do we want to sail? Captain says, yeah, let's go ahead and go. Because the storms, when they made that decision, I don't think they were, it's like out in the middle of the storm.
No.
It's real stormy.
No,
it's like, okay, it's calm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can go ahead and make it to the next port or wherever we're going to go.
Right.
No problem.
It looks great.
Paul says, no, let's not go. And like you said, the centurion believed the captain of the ship. And yeah, I'm a sailor. It's calm. We can make it over to this next port.
Right.
Stuff.
And then the winds come up that will push them there, and they're thinking, this is where we go. And then the big winds come up and start pushing them in one direction. So then it becomes a matter of, how do we just save our lives? First it's, how do we save the ship and the cargo and the people and everything? Then it becomes, how do we save everybody's life? Moving forward. Okay, so let's finish this chapter real quick. When they had gone, in verse 21, when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have sailed from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. He's not saying I told you so, even though he's saying, see, you should have listened. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And if you're the captain, you're thinking, that's encouraging. But, they're again, this is in the middle of the storm. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life, just the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. But when the 14th night came, so here's 2 weeks in this storm, As we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern or the back of the boat and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish." Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat it. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could, and casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind, and were heading for the beach. So it was a forward sail that they set up. But striking a reef where 2 seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks, others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Okay. So that was harrowing. I mean, these guys are throwing out anchors because they're getting blown so hard. They've dropped sails already, and the ship is being blown so hard they have to put out anchors to kind of give them a little direction. Not, like what Dave was saying, they had no way to really steer this thing. Once they notice they're getting close to land, they finally do put out that foresail, not the big one, but the one in front. And they grind this thing up. And the waves are still strong enough that the back of the boat is just getting ripped to shreds because the waves are so big. Okay, how is it that Paul, and this is something we keep talking about, how is it that Paul can encourage these others? And it's just amazing to me, in the middle of this hurricane, that you got a guy saying, "Courage, guys." How can he do this? Dave? Okay. So here, for me, it goes all the way back before he even goes to Jerusalem, when he knows he's going to Rome. And he just has this great faith, right? He knows, God says, God's sent me to Rome. It's going to happen. It's not going to not happen. And he's just, in my mind, it's just amazing to see this fellow who has such great faith encouraging people in the middle of this certain death. They thought we were going to die, right? That was the last thing, that's where we left off previously. We gave up all hope. And now he's saying, take courage. Aaron.
Well, Paul knew that he was going to Rome, but until the angel came and revealed a little more of the specifics around God's plan, he had no guarantee that the people with him were safe. But God granted those souls, safe passage through this storm. And so now Paul has an encouraging message to share with the rest of the crew. There was it could have happened a number of ways. Paul got to Rome, and until this revelation, he didn't know what was going to happen with all the people traveling with him.
Okay, yeah, I think it's all of those things are. I think that's a great point. He doesn't know the whole story until this moment. But he's taken great courage from it. Like you say, he knows he's going, and now he knows everybody else. And here's how it has to play out. How important is it for it to play out the way he says? How do we see that? When the sailors are telling people, yeah, we're going to put some anchors out on the bow, yeah, and they're letting down the ship. What does Paul say? Yeah, he tells the centurion, if those guys leave, we're all doomed. And to me, that's, I try to put myself in those sailors. They're just trying to save their own lives. They're like, whatever happens to you guys, whatever, we're out of here. We're taking the boat and we're leaving. And then these Roman soldiers come and cut the ropes. And so, they had to be thinking, okay, I guess we have to just now we have to listen to what Paul was saying. And the guys, and it's just interesting to see. I don't know, has anybody ever been on a jetty before? Been on a jetty? Have you ever been in the water next to a jetty? That can be really scary because, the water just pushes you around wherever it's going to push you, and it can push you right into the rocks, and you can get all cut up. And this is the kind of the situation these people are in. These waves haven't subsided, but apparently they were small enough that people can swim through them, and at the same time grab a. If you didn't know how to swim, this is the providence. I see God's providence here. People who don't even know how to swim are saved. The likelihood of 276 people with probably a large number not knowing how to swim, it would not have turned out this way had God not had his hand in it. Why does the centurion want to help Paul? Again, we're getting back to this. He sees Paul's faith, right? But it wouldn't have been. It would have been okay if he just went along with his the other soldiers and just killed all the prisoners and said, we were afraid they were going to escape. We didn't want that to happen, so we went ahead and killed them. But why does he want to help Paul? Who knows? Exactly. But I think it gets back to what we were talking about. Paul's just being a Christian. He's following his belief. And that had to have an impact on this guy. He had to just see that Paul there's something about what he's saying There's something about his message that has way more power, and he just told everybody how it's going to happen, and it's happening. So he sees that there's God's working through him. Okay?
I think this centurion is getting some faith. I think he's
Yeah.
beginning to believe.
Yeah.
And I even wonder if maybe once he got back to Rome, maybe he was part of the Rome church.
That's, like Aaron says, who knows? But that's kind of what I'm seeing here is when we see these people, and in all of these instances, Joseph and Daniel and all these people who are in the middle of people who don't care about God, they don't care about Christians or anything like that. The Philippian jailer, right? He was converted. There's something about the word that can affect anybody, and that is the beautiful part about this story in my mind. Okay, we will finish up next week, and then we'll be moving into Daniel.